7 of us left Derrick Knob shelter after dark, and only 4 reached Double Spring Gap. The 12-foot aluminum survey rod on this table was straight when we carried it in. This sworn testimony is given on November 17, 1987, in Conference Room B of the Sugarlands Administration Building, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, before the Southeast Regional Incident Review Panel, with the Deputy Superintendent presiding. My name is James Mercer. I am 44, and I was the backcountry district ranger assigned to the Central Ridge. What first told me something was wrong was not noise in the trees. It was measured pressure through the soles of my boots, as if another set of feet had found my pace under the trail. The assignment began on Monday, October 12th. Our mission was one sentence on the work order: measure an 870-foot section of unstable tread north of Derrick Knob and mark a safe line for a spring repair crew. 3 days of rain had opened cracks along the downhill edge. Hikers had reported loose rock, and one section had dropped enough to hold water. We were not searching for an animal. We were not investigating a story. We were there to put numbers on dirt and get out before the next weather front. I led the party because that section fell inside my district. I could read sign, judge travel time, and move a crew off a ridge without a marked side trail. My failure was simpler. When ground behaved strangely, I trusted the explanation that kept the job ordinary. I carried a government field watch on a black band, and before I read the time I tapped the crystal twice with my thumbnail. Everybody on that crew knew the habit. Ray Cobb used to say he could tell how bad a problem was by how many times I tapped. Daniel Pike was 51 and licensed in Tennessee and North Carolina. He could close a line over broken mountain ground with less error than anybody I had worked with. He also believed an instrument before he believed the person holding it. His phrase was, "The level doesn't lie." He said it when the numbers were good, and he said it when they were not. Daniel's mistake was treating every bad number as a problem that one more reading could settle. Ray Cobb was our trail foreman. He was 46, broad through the shoulders, and better with cribbing and stone than most men are with a pencil. Ray could look at a rotten section of tread and tell you how many hours it would take to rebuild. He hated leaving a cut unfinished. One clean cut, he would say, whether he was trimming a root or ending an argument. That habit made him dependable in daylight. It made him slow to leave at night. Tommy Vance, 27, handled the 2 pack mules and most of our heavy gear. He could bring stock through switchbacks where I would have preferred to walk empty-handed. Tommy's failure was that he trusted the mules so completely he sometimes stopped trusting himself. He had a saying, too: "Mules know first." He used it about weather, bears, loose footing, and bad people. I had heard it often enough that I quit hearing the warning inside it. Earl Fenner was 32 and carried the radio, spare battery, and our written call schedule. He could make a weak signal reach the Sugarlands desk from places where my set produced nothing but hiss. Earl's problem was his confidence in equipment he had checked himself. Once he had wrapped a battery, tightened an antenna, or marked a time, he treated failure as somebody else's mistake. He rolled the radio dial back and forth under his thumb even when the set was off. Leon Tate was 35, a trail hand out of Sevier County. He could swing a Pulaski all day without tearing the tread or himself apart. Leon counted under his breath while he worked. 4 strokes, change angle. 4 more, clear the chips. His failure was that he followed an established rhythm even when the ground changed. Wally Kress, our 7th man, was 59 and a volunteer maintainer who had worked that ridge since 1963. He knew every spring, shelter, blaze, and false turn between Spencefield and Klingman's Dome. Wally sharpened his pocket knife each night, 6 passes on one side and 6 on the other. He had gotten us the original maintenance notes for the slumped section. We entered from the Tennessee side at 7:20 that Monday morning. The 2 mules carried the transit case, Daniel's level, the 12-foot rod, 50 survey stakes, 2 canvas tool rolls, food for 5 nights, and a 5-gallon water can we intended to fill at the shelter spring. Each man carried his bedroll, rain shell, lunch, flashlight, and 1 extra pair of wool socks. I had a first aid pouch, compass topographic sheet, 6 road flares, and a 30-foot length of rope. No firearms were issued for trail work, and none were needed for the assignment we had. The climb took 8 hours and 12 minutes with 2 stops to reset loads. At 4 minutes past 3, the mules stopped on the approach to Derrick Knob. Both animals planted their front feet and leaned backward against the lead ropes. Tommy clicked his tongue, pulled once, then stopped. He did not strike them. He walked ahead, checked the trail, and came back. "Nothing broke loose," he said. "They just don't want that turn." The turn was 63 paces below the shelter spur. I walked it twice. The tread was firm. I found old bear scat well off the trail, maybe 3 days old, and one fresh scuff where a mule shoe had cut the outside edge. Nothing else. Tommy brought the animals around one at a time with feed in his hand. They passed the turn, but both kept their heads high and their ears aimed uphill. An older southbound hiker was sitting at the shelter when we arrived. He had no trail name written on his pack, and he did not give us a real one. Gray beard, green rain cover, left boot patched at the toe with silver tape. I estimated him at 60 to 65. He watched Daniel unload the rod. Then he asked whether we planned to stay after sundown. Ray told him we planned to stay 4 nights. The hiker said, "If the ridge starts stepping under you, don't step with it. Get off the white marks before it learns you." That was the ignored warning. I asked whether he had felt blasting aircraft or a small ground tremor. He packed his cup without answering. At 3:38, he took the Appalachian Trail north towards Siler's Bald. We never found his name in the Derrick Knob register. Wally said some older hikers avoided registers, and I accepted that. We worked 2 hours that afternoon. Daniel established a reference point in exposed rock 19 feet north of the trail. Ray and Leon cleared brush from the first station. Earl reached Sugarlands at 5:40 and reported 7 personnel, 2 animals, no injuries. Work started. Tommy watered the mules. Wally checked the shelter roof and spring pipe. At 6:11, 11 minutes before sundown, I walked the white blazes back to the shelter and counted 53 fresh stakes in Daniel's bundle. We had brought 50. 3 belonged to an older survey and were gray with age. That explained the count, and I wrote it down. The first night passed without a sighting. Twice, at 9:14 and 9:28, the mules pulled against their picket line. There was no bear at the food cables and no animal in the shelter clearing. Each pull lasted about 6 seconds. Tommy sat up in his bedroll and listened. After the second, he said, "Mules know first." Nobody asked what they knew. We had been on the move for 14 hours. We put the lantern out at 9:40 and slept. Tuesday, October 13th began at 5:50. The temperature at the shelter thermometer was 38 degrees. Wind came from the northwest at 7 to 10 miles an hour by my estimate. Visibility opened after 8, and we could see the Tennessee side below the cloud line. Those details matter because nothing about the weather suggested thunder, heavy runoff, or a slide moving beneath us. Daniel set his instrument at Station 1 at 7:12. He placed the rod on our rock reference and took the first reading. Ray and Leon cut a narrow working shelf along the high side. Wally followed, driving stakes at 25-foot intervals. Tommy kept the mules tied at the shelter because the work area was too narrow for stock. Earl remained between the crew and the spur junction so he could relay a call if the ridge blocked our signal. For 9 hours, the work was ordinary. The slumped tread measured 868 feet from the shelter side crack to the northern end, 2 feet shorter than the work order. Its greatest vertical drop was 11 3/8 inches. The outside edge had separated from the uphill bank in 5 places. Daniel believed water had moved through buried organic soil under the tread. Ray agreed and marked 3 sections for cribbing. I saw no fresh animal sign larger than deer. At 4:49, the pressure reached the soles of my feet. It was not a jolt. A jolt has an edge. This rose through both boots at the same time, held for a count of 2, and stopped. The ground did not visibly move. My knees did not shift. Loose needles on the tread stayed in place. I lifted my right foot, set it down, and felt nothing. 14 seconds later, the pressure returned for another count of 2. Leon stopped swinging his Pulaski. His hands remained on the handle. "You feel that?" he asked. I told him to hold position. I tapped my watch twice and timed the next interval. 14 seconds. Pressure for 2 seconds, 14 seconds. Pressure for 2. It came 6 times, then stopped at 4:51. Ray had been kneeling on a stone 10 yards ahead, he said. He had felt nothing in his hands or knees. Wally was standing in leaf litter off the tread and felt nothing at all. Daniel was 75 feet behind us. He called my name before I called his. His instrument had not shifted on its legs, but the bubble moved off-center during each pulse. He did not know that Leon and I had felt anything. He asked everybody to stay where they were while he checked the reference. "The level doesn't lie," he said. He took 3 readings. The middle differed by 3/16 of an inch, then returned to the earlier number. Daniel checked the rod foot, the rock, and the clamp on his instrument. He found no looseness. When I asked whether a distant truck or aircraft could do that, he said not in a 14-second interval and not without movement in the legs. Tommy came down from the shelter at 5:03. Both mules had started pulling at 4:49. He had checked his watch because our afternoon radio call was due at 5. The animals pulled 6 times. Each pull lasted about 2 seconds. He had counted 14 seconds between the last 3. That was independent confirmation from 3 positions: our boots, Daniel's bubble, and the animals at the shelter. I wrote all 3 in the field log. I labeled the cause possible subsurface movement because the trail had already slumped and because that was an explanation we could put on a work order. We finished at 5:20. The route back to Derrick Knob took 19 minutes. On the way, Leon walked behind me and counted his steps in groups of 4. At the 32nd step, a lighter pulse came through the tread. Leon stopped. I took one more step before I understood that he had stopped. The next pulse came when my boot landed. I stood with my right foot forward. Nothing followed. Leon said, "Take another." I did. The pressure arrived under the sole as my weight settled. I stepped again. It answered again. 5 steps, 5 pressures. Then I moved off the white-blazed trail into the uphill brush. My next step produced nothing. Leon stayed on the tread and shifted his left foot forward. Pressure met him through the ground. We changed places. On the trail it met me. Off the trail it did not. The difference was plain enough that I looked back toward the others. Ray was folding a tool roll. Daniel was writing. Wally had already rounded the bend. I could have called them back and repeated the test with every man watching. Instead, I told Leon we were standing over loose fill and ordered him to keep moving. I did not speak about the timing. That silence cost us the only daylight test we had while the pressure was still confined to the soles of our feet. At the shelter, Earl reported that the 5 o'clock call had been clean. Sugarlands had no record of blasting, seismic activity, aircraft trouble, or storms in the district. He used none of those words as a specialist. He simply said the desk had nothing that matched our report. I asked him to request a check with the county in the morning. He wrote it on his schedule. Dinner was beans, canned meat, and cornbread Wally had carried in a cloth sack. The mules would not eat until Tommy moved their feed 22 feet downhill from the picket line. Even there, they kept turning their heads toward the shelter spur. No animal crossed the clearing. I checked the food bags twice. They were 9 feet above the ground and 4 feet from the nearest trunk. At 8:17, Ray laid a steel cup on the shelter floor. It moved 1/4 inch toward the open side. We all saw it. The floor was not level, so he set it back and placed his folded bandana beneath it. At 8:31, the cup moved again. There was no pressure through my boots because I was sitting on the lower bunk with my feet raised. Leon placed one palm flat on the floor. After 12 seconds, he removed it. "Same count," he said. No one slept before midnight. We did not hear an approach, a branch breaking, or an animal circling. Every 14 seconds for 11 minutes, the floor accepted a weight we could not see and released it 2 seconds later. When it stopped all at once. The mules lowered their heads. Earl's radio dial quit moving under his thumb. At 12:06, Wally sharpened his pocket knife. 6 passes on one side, 6 on the other. He closed it, looked at the trail, and said the white blazes were brighter than they had been the night before. I checked them with my flashlight. The paint was old and chipped. The beam made the marks look fresh. That was the explanation I gave him. Wally did not argue. Wednesday, October 14th started with both mules gone from the picket line. Their ropes had not broken. The brass snaps were still closed around the steel ring, and both halters lay side by side on the ground. Tommy found the animals 180 yards downhill in a stand of beech. They were facing away from the shelter. Neither had a cut, and neither was lathered from running. The smaller mule had a strip of gray survey flagging looped around its right foreleg. Daniel used red flagging. The gray strip matched the 3 old stakes we had counted on Monday. Ray wanted to finish the line before the animals caused another delay. Tommy wanted to take them out. He did not demand it. He said, "Mules know first," and looked at me. I told him the snaps had probably been fastened badly and ordered him to use rope knots in addition to the hardware. That was the first time somebody suggested leaving. It was not the refusal required later in this record. Tommy accepted the order and stayed. The worksite had changed overnight. Station 3. A wooden stake driven 14 inches into firm soil stood on top of the tread. The hole remained 5 feet away. No soil clung to the stake. Its point was not damaged. Ray tried to push it back into the hole and found the opening too narrow by 1/8 inch. The stake had entered the ground the day before because Wally had struck it 21 times with a 3-pound hammer. It had come out without widening the hole. That was the one displaced artifact. Daniel photographed the stake beside the opening and measured both. He used the vocabulary of his own field. He called the hole our occupied point, the rock reference our benchmark, and the difference between yesterday's line and that morning's line a failure to close. He did not call it impossible. Surveyors do not get paid to call things impossible. He said, our traverse showed a closure error of 1 11/16 inches over 868 feet. The level doesn't lie, he said. Ray answered, dirt does. They spent 43 minutes checking one another. Daniel reset the tripod. Ray dug around the old stake hole. Leon removed loose material by hand. Wally found the gray stakes and laid them in a straight row. I watched the time and kept Earl on the radio schedule. No one found a disturbed route, an underground void, or a surface crack that explained the change. At 10:22, Daniel asked me to stand on Station 3. The pressure was faint through my boot soles, less than the day before. Then my lower teeth touched my upper teeth without my jaw closing. I opened my mouth. The contact continued inside the bone. It did not chatter. It was one held pressure, as if the shape of my jaw had become the struck end of a tool. 2 seconds. Release. 14 seconds. 2 seconds again. Leon saw me lift a hand to my face. He had felt it too. He pressed his lips together and counted 4 work strokes under his breath, but there was no tool in his hands. Daniel stood behind the level with his teeth apart. After the 3rd pulse, he removed his eyeglasses and set them on the instrument case. Don't tell me what you felt, he said. Write it. He tore 3 pages from the back of his field book. Each of us wrote separately. My words were, pressure through lower jaw, both sides, 2 seconds. Leon wrote. Teeth moved, though mouth was open. Daniel wrote, vibration in jawbone, regular duration. We folded the pages before reading them. The time on all 3 was 10:22. The level bubble shifted 1/16 inch during each pulse. That was smaller than Tuesday's 3/16 movement. The effect in the jaw was stronger, while the instrument movement was weaker. Daniel did not offer an explanation. He set a dime on the rock reference. The dime remained upright through 5 pulses, then fell toward the trail on the 6th. We measured the interval for 19 minutes. It stayed at 14 seconds within the limit of our wristwatches. Daniel changed the length of his steps. The pulses did not change. Ray struck the ground with the flat of his shovel. No response. Leon resumed his 4-stroke rhythm. On his 4th stroke, the pressure met his jaw. He stopped counting. The next pulse waited. That word is accurate. It waited. When Leon made a single stroke, pressure followed. When he made 2, it followed the second. Daniel asked him to make no movement for 1 minute. Nothing came through the ground. Then Daniel moved the rod 6 inches. Pressure climbed through all 3 of our jaws at the instant the rod foot scraped stone. We tested the trail, not the brush. Ray stepped off the tread and struck the soil twice. Nothing. Wally stood on a white blaze and shifted his weight. The pressure answered. Earl, stationed 50 yards back, could not feel it while standing off the trail. He placed one boot on the tread and tapped the heel. His head jerked once. He moved away without being told. The effect was not following a fixed 14-second pattern anymore. It was following work performed on the Appalachian Trail. I suspended digging at 11:05. That was the correct action, but I did not order an evacuation. We still had daylight, food, working radios, and 7 healthy men. The forecast called for rain late Thursday. My written judgment was that a hidden fracture beneath the tread was transmitting tool impacts through a narrow rock layer. Daniel said he had never seen a fracture respond to a man before the man moved. I told him response was not the right word. He did not argue. He wrote it in his field book. At noon, we walked south, away from the work site, to test whether the effect ended with the slump. The white-blazed trail rose over a low knob. We traveled single file with 20 feet between men. I went first. Daniel carried the rod collapsed to 6 feet. Ray carried no tool. Earl stayed at the rear with the radio. After 600 paces, I stepped off the trail. The pressure stopped for me, but continued down the line, moving from man to man in the order of their footfalls. Tommy was fourth. He froze with one boot raised. The others stopped behind him. For 37 seconds, nothing moved. No wind touched the high branches. A red squirrel crossed a log downhill, and we all watched it because it was the only living thing that did not appear to be waiting. Tommy lowered his boot into the leaves beside the tread. Nothing answered. He stepped fully off. Then Leon behind him moved forward on the white blazes. The pressure struck all of our jaws at once, including Tommy's off the trail. Distance no longer protected him after the line had reached him. We returned to Derrick Knob at 1:48. Earl made the 2 o'clock call and asked Sugarlands for a pickup team Thursday morning. He described an unstable work site and possible equipment damage. He did not describe the pressure because I had not put it in the radio log as a safety cause. The desk told us the nearest available stock crew could reach us after noon if weather held. I accepted that schedule. The first rain arrived at 4:10, 20 hours earlier than forecast. It came as fine drops that collected on spruce needles and made no runoff. Visibility fell to 90 feet. We secured the tools under a canvas fly, tied both mules with double ropes, and moved our food sacks 2 feet higher. Ray checked the shelter sill. Wally counted the white blazes visible through the chain link front. There were 4. At 5:36, there were 5. The additional mark stood on a tree 31 feet beyond the normal trail turn. It was rectangular, approximately 2 inches wide and 6 inches tall. Through rain and fog, it looked like a white blaze. I walked to it with Wally. Up close, there was no paint. The bark had been rubbed pale. Its upper edge was 7 feet 9 inches above the ground. Wally was 5 feet 10 inches. He reached as high as he could and stopped 14 inches below the mark. I used the collapsed rod to measure from the root flare. 7 feet 9 1/4 inches. The pale area had damp fibers hanging from it, but no fresh cut. Whatever made it had pressed the dark outer bark flat and exposed the lighter surface beneath. We did not hear anything beyond that tree. We saw no track in the wet needles. The pressure touched my jaw once while I held the rod against the trunk. It did not touch Wally. He was standing off the trail. Back at the shelter, Daniel extended the rod to 12 feet and checked it against the rear wall. It was straight. He measured the chain link front, the floor, and the distance to the pale mark. Those numbers gave us something to do with our hands. The chain link front of the shelter was 12 feet 8 inches wide. The lower bunk stood 22 inches above the floor. The pale mark was 54 feet from where Daniel sat, Night came at 6:19. The rain stopped at 7:02. At 7:40, the pressure returned through our jaws. It arrived when nobody moved. This time the interval was 11 seconds. Daniel recorded 12 pulses at 11-second intervals, then 10 at 9 seconds, then 8 at 7. The duration remained 2 seconds. The numbers were decreasing. The effect was approaching us by time rather than distance. Ray set the steel cup on the floor with the bandana beneath it. The cup moved 3/8 inch on the first pulse and 1/2 inch on the fourth. Daniel measured both movements from a pencil line. Tuesday's movement had been 1/4 inch. Wednesday's greatest movement was 1/2 inch. Same object, same floor, same direction, twice the displacement, at 8:08. 8:08, the cup slid 6 inches and struck the edge of the shelter. The sound was small. The mules answered downhill by pulling both ropes tight. One rope snapped at the picket knot. Tommy ran into the clearing with his flashlight. I followed him to the spur. The light found both mules still tied. Their ropes angled toward the trail, but the animals leaned downhill so hard their front knees shook. Between them and the white blaze stood empty rain. Then my jaw held shut for 2 seconds. Tommy did not move until it released. He whispered, "It came up the path." I told him we had not seen anything. That statement was true at 8:08 on Wednesday night. It remained true for another 22 hours. Thursday, October 15th, gave us 6 hours of clear weather. The pickup crew never came. At 8:12, Earl received a broken message from Sugarlands. Wind had dropped trees on the approach route, and stock could not pass until the trail was cut open. The desk expected a delay of 1 day. Our food was adequate. The shelter was sound. Every person could walk. I reported that we would remain in place. Tommy looked at me but said nothing. He spent the morning checking both animals. Their eyes were clear, legs uninjured, breathing normal. Neither would cross the shelter spur onto the Appalachian Trail. They would approach within 16 feet of the white blaze, then turn sideways. Tommy tried a blindfold on the smaller mule. It backed downhill before its front hoof touched the tread. Daniel returned to the worksite at 9 with me, Ray, Leon, and Wally. We carried no cutting tools. His purpose was to verify whether the reference points had moved again. Earl and Tommy stayed at the shelter. We walked off the trail wherever the terrain allowed, keeping the white blazes to our right. That added 41 minutes to a trip that normally took 19. Station 1 remained unchanged. Station 2 differed by 3/8 inch. Station 3, where the old stake had come out, differed by 1 3/4 inches from Monday's line. Daniel ran the measurement twice. Then he reversed his setup and ran it from the opposite direction. His 3 results agreed within 1/16 inch. He spoke into Earl's small cassette recorder at 10:43. His exact statement was, "Benchmark A is stable. The foresight at Station 3 indicates a lateral displacement of 1.75 inches toward the center line." Reversal agrees. No corresponding vertical settlement is present. Traverse does not close on the occupied point. Instrument check is within tolerance. That was the specialist finding. Daniel used the terms because they were his terms. I accepted the result. I still did not order us out. Instead, I asked whether a buried rock plate could pivot sideways without dropping. Daniel stared down the trail for 11 seconds. Then he said a mountain could do anything over enough time, but it could not move 1 3/4 inches between breakfasts and leave pine needles standing upright. Ray found something at the outside edge. 6 shallow depressions crossed the damp tread, each 11 inches long and 5 to 6 inches wide. They were not tracks in the usual sense. There was no heel, toe, pad, or claw. The soil looked compressed from below, as if weight had pushed up and then settled back. The spacing from center to center was 41 inches. We measured the line. It began in brush below the trail, crossed all 26 inches of tread, and ended against the uphill bank. No mark continued up the bank. Wally pushed his fingers into one depression. The soil beneath was firmer than the surrounding dirt. Ray cut a square plug beside it and found roots intact. Leon started counting without a tool in his hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. He stopped. 14 seconds passed. Nothing answered. He counted again. On 4, pressure entered my jaw. A moment later it moved lower. It reached the center of my chest behind the sternum and stayed for 2 seconds. My breath stopped because the muscles would not move against it. When it released, I took one breath through my mouth. The back of my throat carried the same pressure, not a second sensation, but the same measured force higher inside me. Ray sat down on the tread. Daniel gripped the rod with both hands. Wally stepped into the brush. Leon was still on 3. He refused to say 4. Daniel looked at me. He did not ask what I had felt. He pressed his palm to the center of his own chest and nodded once. That was when I should have spoken. I should have given the evacuation order at Station 3 in daylight, with every man standing and the northbound route open. I did not. I told Daniel to finish the measurement while I walked the route back. The pressure followed me through 39 steps. It did not arrive under each foot now. It gathered behind my sternum as I moved and released whenever I stopped. At step 12 it held for 3 seconds. At step 24 it held for 4. At step 39 my throat closed around a breath for 5 seconds. I moved off the trail and knelt in wet brush. The force released at once. I watched the white blaze tread from 6 feet away. One pine needle rose from the center, as if caught on a breath from below. It stood upright, turned half a circle, and lay down pointing north. The others came off the trail without instruction. Daniel carried the rod. Ray carried the field book. We reached the shelter at 12:20 by the off-trail route. Earl had missed 2 scheduled calls. His radio received the Sugarland signal, but the desk could not hear him from the clearing. He tried from 3 positions. At the third, he stepped onto the Appalachian Trail, raised the antenna, and made contact immediately. The moment Sugarlands answered, Earl bent forward with one hand on his chest. He completed the call in short phrases. Weather clear. 7 personnel. 2 animals. Departure planned at first light Friday. No medical emergency. When the desk asked why his voice kept breaking, he said the ridge was interfering with transmission. He did not use technical language. He used the only explanation I had authorized. At 1:06, Daniel laid his field book open on the shelter floor. Monday's line, Tuesday's check, Wednesday's failed closure, Thursday's 1 3/4 inch displacement. The page showed a movement toward the Appalachian Trail on every reading. Not downhill, not toward the slope failure, toward the center of the white blaze tread. The level doesn't lie, he said for the last time. Nobody answered him. We packed for departure. Each man reduced his load to water, 1 meal, rain shell, light, and bedroll. Ray wrapped the transit and leveled for the mules. Daniel kept the rod and field book. Earl tested both batteries. I divided the 6 flares between myself, Ray, and Tommy. Wally placed his knife in his shirt pocket without sharpening it. The route decision was mine. We could move south toward Spencefield and an access trail, or north past the worksite toward Double Spring Gap and Klingman's Dome Road. South was shorter to an exit trail. North led toward the road but required crossing the affected section. I chose north because Sugarlands could meet us at Klingman's Dome Road, and because the tread remained physically passable. At 2:20, Tommy tried to lead the mules onto the northbound trail. Both refused at the white blaze. 6 men pushed, pulled, and covered their eyes. The animals went to their knees. After 9 minutes, Tommy removed their loads. We cached the transit case, level, tool rolls, and 2 days of food inside the shelter. The mules would go downhill on the side trail, away from the Appalachian Trail. But that route did not connect with our northbound evacuation line. I ordered Tommy to release them toward the stock approach and leave their halters on. He slapped each animal once on the rump. They moved downhill at a trot and did not look back. Mules knew first, he said. This time I heard him. We still did not leave. Daniel wanted one final reading at dusk because the movement had been strongest near sundown. Ray wanted the gear secured against rain. Earl wanted a clean radio contact at 5. I turned those 3 wants into one order, departure at 5:30 after the final call and final measurement. At 4:58, cloud rose from the Tennessee side and covered the ridge. Visibility fell from 200 yards to 40 feet in less than 6 minutes. Earl reached Sugarlands at 5:01. He reported 7 men departing north at 5:30. Expected Double Spring Gap before midnight. Klingman's Dome Road Friday morning. The desk repeated the plan. I tapped my watch twice and wrote it down. At 5:12, The pressure came through the shelter floor, into my sternum, and up the back of my throat. It lasted 6 seconds. 11 seconds later it came again for 6. The same force moved through all 7 men. Nobody needed to compare notes. Outside, one white mark showed through the cloud. Then, a second appeared behind it, higher than the first. The second mark shifted its weight. I checked my watch at 5:13 and 9 seconds. I tapped the crystal twice. The higher mark stood at the edge of visibility, 117 feet from the chain link front. I know the distance because Daniel had measured 54 feet to the rubbed tree the night before, and because the object stood at the third temporary stake beyond it. Those stakes were set at 25-foot intervals. The error in my estimate could not have exceeded 3 feet. The object was on the Appalachian Trail. Fog covered it from the knees down. Above that, it held the general arrangement of a person standing upright. 2 legs, a trunk, shoulders, a head set low between them. I did not see clothing. I did not see hair in the way a person sees individual hair. Its surface broke the gray light into dark, uneven strips, the way wet hemlock bark does when you turn it under a lantern. Daniel lifted the leveling rod without extending it. His hands were steady. He used the rubbed mark on the tree, the known height of the rod, and the slope between us. He said the top of the object was between 7 feet 10 inches and 8 feet 1 inch above the trail. My own estimate, based on the 6-foot chain link front and the tree mark, was 7 feet 11 inches. It did not crouch. It did not raise its arms. It turned its head toward the shelter and watched. The head movement was human in speed. That is the best working comparison I can give. A bear swings its muzzle and shoulders together. This thing shifted its face first, then allowed the shoulders to follow. Its weight rested over one leg. The other leg stood half a step ahead, as if it had stopped while walking north. All 7 of us were visible behind the chain link front. Ray stood on my left. Tommy was behind him. Wally and Leon were at the rear wall. Earl held the radio against his chest. Daniel stood on my right with the rod. Nobody called to it. At 5:13 and 22 seconds, it moved its forward foot. The sole of my right boot accepted the pressure first. It passed into my jaw, settled behind the sternum, and held at the back of my throat. One force, one continuous path. My hands stopped moving. The pressure lasted 7 seconds while the object completed a single step. Its foot came down on the white blazed trail. I did not see the foot itself through the fog. I saw the body lower under weight and rise over the leg. The motion resembled a man crossing a creek on loose stones, testing, loading, then committing. Leon whispered the numbers he used at work. 1, 2, 3. He did not say 4. The object turned its head toward him. Leon closed his mouth. The pressure released from all of us. At 5:13 and 37, Ray shifted his boot backward. The object shifted its rear foot by the same amount. Ray stopped. Tommy raised his right hand halfway. The near arm of the object lifted from its side, not halfway, but enough to show that the movement belonged to a joint and not a hanging branch. Tommy lowered his hand. The arm lowered. Daniel said, "Do not give it a line." That was the only instruction spoken during the sighting. It was survey language. A line connected known points. Daniel had understood before I did that every movement we made gave the thing another point. At 5:13 and 51, the object stepped sideways off the tread. The pressure vanished from my chest but remained in my jaw. It stood in the brush for 6 seconds. Then it stepped back onto the white blazes, and the pressure dropped through my whole skeleton to both heels. The difference was exact. On the trail, full force. Off the trail, jaw only. It had learned what we had learned on Tuesday. For 9 seconds, I saw only the rubbed white mark on the high tree. When the opening cleared, the object had advanced to the next stake. It had crossed 25 feet without any of us seeing a step. Its distance was now 92 feet. Earl's radio spoke once. The Sugarland's desk was calling our unit number for the 5:30 departure check. The voice came through thin but understandable. Earl did not answer. The object angled its head toward the radio. The next pressure carried the cadence of the dispatcher. 3 short phrases came through the speaker. 3 holds moved from my heels to my throat. The thing did not reproduce the voice. It reproduced the timing inside our bodies. Earl turned the volume down. The object shifted forward. At 70 feet, I could see both arms. They reached below the point where a man's hands normally fall. I could not count fingers. The hands remained turned inward against the legs. The shoulders were narrower than the height suggested, but the chest was deep from front to back. It carried no pack tool or light. I looked for eyes because that is what a ranger looks for in a night animal. I saw no reflected shine. The face held one shade darker than the fog. A lighter line crossed where the mouth would have been. It did not open. Wally moved his pocket knife from his shirt pocket to his pants pocket. The object's hand moved across its own body. It had no pocket to receive anything, so the hand stopped at the opposite hip. Ray breathed out through his nose. The object raised its head. Tommy held his breath. Earl's thumb rested on the radio dial. Leon kept his count at 3. Daniel held the rod across his chest like a gate. At 5:14 and 28, the pressure stopped. The sudden release made my knees unlock. I caught the shelter post. That was the first action any of us took that the object did not copy. It remained still and watched me recover. Then it changed behavior. It turned its back to us. The turn began at the feet, traveled through the hips, and ended at the head. It faced north toward our planned route to Double Spring Gap. It placed one foot on the trail and waited with the other behind. Ray said later that it looked like a man taking the lead. I agree with that working comparison. At 5:14 and 41, it took 3 steps north. Each step came through the shelter floor and our bodies. The first lasted 2 seconds. The second lasted 4. The third lasted 8. After the third, it looked back over its left shoulder. At 5:14 and 51 seconds, fog closed across the tread. The sighting lasted 1 minute and 42 seconds. We did not see the creature again during that period or afterward. What followed came through the trail, through our lights, and through the spaces where men had been standing. For 15 seconds after it disappeared, no one moved. Then Leon said 4. The shelter floor struck upward once. Tommy spoke at 5:15 and 14 seconds. We should go now. Off the trail if we have to. We should go. I overruled him. I said we would leave together after Daniel collapsed the rod. Earl completed the radio call, and everybody had a light in hand. The tasks required 7 minutes. I believed order would keep 7 men from becoming separate problems. That was my failure decision. I treated the next 7 minutes as mine to control. Daniel collapsed the rod from 12 feet to 6. Earl answered Sugarlands, but received no reply after his first sentence. Ray distributed the cached food among 4 packs. Wally tied the field book inside a plastic map case. Leon stood at the chain-link shelter front and said nothing. Tommy kept his pack on and faced north. At 5:18, pressure held behind my sternum for 9 seconds. At 5:19, it held for 10. The intervals were no longer regular. They came after buckles snapped, feet shifted, or the radio clicked. Each small human action brought a longer hold. We left Derrick Knob at 5:22, 7 minutes after Tommy's warning. Daylight had not fully gone, but the cloud made it night under the trees. Our order was Ray first, then Earl, Wally, Tommy, Daniel, Leon, and me at the rear. Ray carried the compass and 1 flare. Earl carried the radio. Tommy carried the rope. Daniel carried the rod. I carried the field book and 2 flares. I ordered 20 feet between men. Nobody was to count aloud. Nobody was to match another man's pace. If pressure entered the chest, we would stop with both feet planted and move off the tread uphill when possible. Those instructions worked for the first mile. The pressure traveled through us without a visible source. It entered Ray first, then Earl, Wally, Tommy, Daniel, Leon, and me, always in trail order. When we stopped, it sometimes continued 1 person farther, as if expecting the next step. Once it passed through me and returned to Ray at the front. That circuit took 49 seconds. Dark came at 6:19. Our flashlights showed no more than 30 feet in cloud. The white blazes appeared one at a time. Some were painted, some were pale places in the bark, taller than a man's reach. We used Wally to distinguish them. He had maintained that section for 24 years. At 6:41, he told Ray to ignore a pale mark and turn left. The false mark continued straight into spruce. We took the left turn. Pressure moved down the unmarked route to our right, step after step, though none of us went that way. At 6:53, Earl reached Sugarlands. He said, 7 moving north, 1 mile from Derrick Knob, visibility 30 feet. The desk asked whether we needed rescue. I took the radio and answered yes. My voice closed behind the sternum on the word yes, but the call went through. Sugarlands ordered us to hold position if safe. I answered that holding on the trail was not safe. Then the signal ended. The first flare was fired at 7:02 from a small opening north of the ridge. Red light spread under the cloud for 28 seconds. We saw the white-blazed path, the uphill bank, and 6 men ahead of me. We also saw a row of depressions forming in the tread between Leon and me. No foot made them. Each depression pressed upward, darkened, and settled. 11 inches long. 41 inches center to center, they advanced toward Leon while he stood still. I told him to step uphill. Leon moved 1 foot into the brush. The pressure reached my jaw. He moved the second foot. It reached my sternum. He was off the trail when the flare died. His flashlight remained visible for 4 seconds, pointed at the ground. Then the light turned parallel to the trail and moved north at walking speed. I called Leon's name once. The light stopped. No voice answered. Ray lit his flashlight from the front and swept it back. 5 men stood between us. Leon was not among them. We found his flashlight on the white-blazed tread 46 feet north of the place he had stepped into the brush. It was standing upright on its lens, casting a narrow circle into the fog. There was no disturbed vegetation between those points. Ray wanted to search downhill. Tommy held his shoulder and said we would lose everybody. I am not certain of the order of the next 2 minutes. I am certain of the following facts. I tied the 30-foot rope around Tommy's waist. The other end went around mine. Daniel stood between us. Earl and Ray remained ahead. Wally was present when the knot was tied. Leon was not. We continued with 6 men at 7:12. At 7:26 we reached the first gray survey stake. We were entering the 868-foot work section. Daniel asked for his field book. I gave it to him. He checked the line by flashlight and said the outer tread had moved farther inward. Ray crawled across the first 20 feet and tested each foothold. The trail held. Wally followed Ray. Earl followed Wally. A pressure passed through my whole body and lifted the rope between Tommy and me. It did not pull from either end. The middle rose 12 inches as if laid across a moving knee. When it fell, Wally's flashlight was on the ground. Ray stood 20 feet ahead. Earl stood 10 feet behind Ray. The distance between Earl and Tommy was empty. Wally had been there 1 pulse before. His pocket knife lay closed beside the light. The blade was sharp. 6 new strokes showed on one side and none on the other. He had not made them while walking. I picked up the knife and put it in my shirt pocket. We did not search the downhill slope. The ground pressure was coming faster than breath. 5 men moved on at 7:31. Station 3 had crossed the trail. The reference rock remained 19 feet north, but the occupied point now stood near the center of the tread. A crack, 2 inches wide, separated the uphill bank from a 44-foot slab of trail. The slab did not drop. It shifted side to side under our lights by less than 2 inches, the same direction Daniel had measured. Ray crossed first on the uphill edge. Earl followed. Tommy moved next with the rope. Daniel and I stayed on the shelter side. When I placed one boot on the slab, pressure filled my soles, jaw, sternum, throat, and back. There was no difference between my body and the outside force. I could not tell whether I was standing on the trail or whether the trail was standing inside me. Daniel drove the collapsed end of the leveling rod into the crack. The slab stopped moving when he held the rod vertical. It moved when he relaxed pressure. He tested that twice. I can hold the line, he said. Take them across. That was his stated reason for remaining. He was the one specialist. He understood the reference point, the direction of movement, and the rod. No one else could keep that improvised line fixed while watching the slab. I tied our rope around my waist and crossed on hands and knees. The distance was 44 feet. It took 1 minute and 19 seconds. Ray pulled from the far side. Tommy kept the line off the ground. Earl aimed his light at my hands. Daniel held the rod behind me. When I reached firm tread, I turned and told him to cross. He shook his head. The slab had begun moving beneath his boots. The rod bowed toward the trail. Daniel pushed it straight and said, "One man moves it. 4 men get home." Ray wanted to go back. I stopped him. That was the same decision continued, not a second decision. Move the surviving party north. We could not cross toward Daniel without releasing the line he was holding. At 7:46, I told Daniel we would send rescuers from Double Spring Gap. He answered that his field book had to go with us. It was already in my pack. We moved north with 4 men. For 63 seconds, our lights caught Daniel's lantern behind us. It remained 8 feet above the trail, hanging from the top section of the rod. Then cloud covered it. The last communication was not a voice. At 7:48, metal struck rock 3 times behind us. 1 tap. 14 seconds. A second tap. 14 seconds. A third. The rod had made the same sound each morning when Daniel set its foot on the benchmark. There was no 4th tap. Ray Cobb, Tommy Vance, Earl Fenner, and I reached Double Spring Gap Shelter at 10:41 Thursday night. We covered 7.4 miles from Derrick Knob in 5 hours and 19 minutes. The normal travel time for an unloaded ranger in daylight was under 3 hours. We arrived with 1 radio, 4 flashlights, 2 flares, 30 feet of rope, Daniel's field book, Wally's pocket knife, and no survey rod. Earl made contact at 10:53. Sugarland sent a road team toward Klingman's Dome and ordered us to remain at Double Spring Gap until first light. Ray stood behind the chain-link gate until dawn. Tommy sat with his boots off and his feet on the bunk. Earl kept the radio volume at its lowest setting. I wrote the names of the 3 missing men and the times we had last seen them. The pressure did not enter the shelter. It passed along the trail outside from south to north at 12:14, 12:28, and 12:42. 3 crossings, 14 minutes apart. Each one consisted of 6 steps. We felt them through the bunk supports, but not through our bodies. No one went to the gate. Search teams entered from both directions Friday morning. 27 park employees and volunteers worked the ridge over the next 6 days. 2 dog teams searched the drainage below the work site. A helicopter flew when cloud permitted. The searchers found Leon's flashlight, where we had left it, and Wally's boot print beside the first gray stake. They found no track leaving the trail at either loss point. They found the cache inside Derrick Knob untouched. The mules reached the stock trail and were recovered Friday afternoon, 3.4 miles downhill. Both halters were still on. One carried a strip of gray survey flagging around its right foreleg. Tommy had removed that strip Wednesday morning and placed it in his pack. The pack was on his back when we reached Double Spring Gap. The strip recovered from the mule was a second piece. No remains were recovered. No clothing was found. No blood was found. There is no recorded evidence that any person suffered a visible injury on that ridge. The official search ended on October 23rd. A smaller maintenance party returned October 29th to recover government equipment and close the damaged tread. At Station 3, they found Daniel's leveling rod driven into the uphill bank, not the crack where he had held it. The bottom foot was 6 inches deep in undisturbed soil. The lantern was gone. The rod measured 12 feet when fully extended and weighed 8 pounds 6 ounces. On first recovery, its middle section showed a lateral offset of 1 3/4 inches across a 36-inch span. That measurement was taken at Derrick Knob by a second licensed surveyor before the rod was moved downhill. He used Daniel's strategy and wrote the number in Daniel's field book. The Regional Materials Office examined the rod on November 5th. Its report concluded that the central aluminum section carried a permanent lateral offset of 1.78 inches, with no jaw marks, clamp scars, impact flattening, or heat discoloration. The office could reproduce a similar curve only by loading the tube across a broad padded surface. The testing machine left marks. The rod on this table has none. The initial observation was 1 3/4 inches. The specialist conclusion was 1.78 inches. Those measurements describe the same bend within the limits of the tools used. They do not explain why Daniel's Thursday survey recorded 1 3/4 inches of movement toward the trail, or why the rod later carried that amount in its own metal. The object was tagged GRSM 87114 and kept in the locked evidence room at Sugarlands until this hearing. It is on the table now, 6 feet from my chair. The middle bows toward the white evidence label. If it is rolled on a flat floor, it rises and falls once per turn. The rod cannot be adjusted, argued with, or asked to remember differently. The panel's draft finding states that 3 men became separated in cloud after an encounter with an unidentified black bear, then died from exposure in inaccessible terrain. I understand why an agency would choose those words. Black bears live throughout the Smokies. Cloud reduces visibility. Exposure takes people who are experienced and equipped. But a bear does not hold a survey line. A bear does not move only on white blazes. A bear does not answer a work rhythm through the soles, jaw, sternum, and throat. A bear does not leave a 12-foot rod bent by the same distance the ground moved the day before. I signed the factual pages of the finding. I did not sign the cause. Beside that paragraph, I wrote 1 word in the left margin. The word is in my handwriting. It is not part of my spoken testimony. Ray Cobb left trail work in December. Earl Fenner transferred to a front country post. Tommy Vance continued packing stock, but he would not cross a white blaze after sundown. I remained a ranger until this panel placed me on administrative duty. Those are personnel facts, not an explanation. Derrick Knob shelter still stands. Double Spring Gap still stands. Between them, the Appalachian Trail continues over the ridge in a line of white marks. Hikers will walk that line after this testimony. Most will hear wind, mice, rain, and their own boots. Those are ordinary sounds, and ordinary sounds deserve ordinary answers. The warding concerns pressure, not sound. It begins under the feet. It waits when you wait. It answers when you give it a pace. By the time it reaches the jaw, it has already learned the distance between your steps. By the time it reaches the sternum, leaving the trail may no longer separate you from it. If you feel a step come through your boots after dark, stop moving and get off the white blazes before it matches you. Leave the trail to whatever is walking it, and do not answer when it takes your pace.